Today, I want to talk about user identity management, not just for logging into Leostream and making sure that you authenticate people correctly there, but then taking the users all the way through their remote desktop session. What we've seen a lot of times is that people, their identities they use to log into Leostream aren't always travel through the entire process. They may need to log into the desktop using a different ID, and being able to manage those different user IDs across the entire lifecycle of the user session is a very important thing to be able to do and something that Leostream excels at. So there's really these four aspects that I'm going to talk about. The identify, authenticate, authorize, assign. And rather than step through them here, let's first talk about identify and authenticate. This is about getting users into your Leostream environment and ensuring that they are who they say they are, and only the authorized users can log in. Now, what we see with identifying, typically people have a username. Along with that goes a password, and that identifies who the user is. But then if I'm typing in my username and password, you really want to make sure it's me typing in the username and password. And so you move on to this kind of second authenticate phase, which usually deals with a second factor. You want not just something the user knows, like their password, but you also want something the user has, which typically can be a push notification, so they have their phone that comes to there, or it might be an authentication token that goes to the Google Authenticator app, for example. But the key is you want to very strictly manage identifying who the user is and then verifying that they really are who they say they are. And we'll show you how you can do that in Leostream. After you've identified and authenticated them, then you want to authorize them. And the subtle difference there is that you're authorizing what they have access to. And you want to always implement a principle of least privilege so that the user has access only to the things they absolutely need to get their job done, and you lock everything else away. And then it's just a matter of, okay, I've given them access to their authorized resources, but now I want to track what they're getting assigned to. And when I'm talking about assigning something to someone, it's basically as soon as they request a connection to it, then that machine becomes theirs, they're assigned to it. And I always want to know, how long is that assignment going on? I want to make sure it's not going on for too long, because I might want to be sharing that resource. And I also just want to track who's using everything. That's very important these days. In case there's some sort of breach, you want to know who had access, what were they doing on that machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you through a Leostream demo that kind of shows how Leostream helps you with these four different steps. And to do that, I'm going to run through a few fun scenarios. First, we're going to look at a domain user login. That's pretty typical. What we see people use Active Directory to log into Leostream. But as I mentioned, that same user ID doesn't necessarily transfer to the end desktop. So here, what I'll do is I log into Leostream as a domain user, and then I'll switch them into a local user on the desktop. We see that done often for Linux, because a lot of Linux machines aren't joined to the domain. You have a local user account on that machine. Then I'll also show you a domain user that logs into the desktop with a shared account. This is great for resources that are shared amongst many users, and typically the application that they're running on the remote desktop is run in a certain user space. So no matter what physical user logs into that remote machine, the same user ID needs to be used to log into the remote machine. And the key there now is that you've assigned the machine to the physical user, but you need to track how long they're assigned to it based on the generic user account that they use to log into the desktop. I should show you how you can map those together in Leostream. So I'm going to do those. We'll show with MFA. It'll be username and password, and then I'll actually be leveraging Duo for this demo for those first two. And then we're going to switch around a little bit and do a SAML login. So in this case, the SAML IDP is handling the authentication and then passing the user over to Leostream. So there, what we'll do is we'll log in on SAML, and then from once we're in Leostream, now we're going to switch to a domain user. So now I'm going to enter username and passwords in on the desktop. And then as a bonus, we're going to talk about rogue user assignment. In Leostream, a rogue user is someone who's logging into a desktop, be that in the cloud, on-prem, whatever you have. Somebody's logging into that desktop, and the Leostream agent is sending a notice to the broker to let Leostream know that that's happening. And that way you know, okay, here's someone who's logged into the machine, and now you can assign that machine to that user and track how long they're using it, and then leverage Leostream to reboot the machine, log the user out when they're idle, do all the other things that a Leostream allows you to do if the user logs in through Leostream. So this ability to actually capture these rogue users is very important for monitoring and managing your system. So let's switch to sharing my screen and show this all in action. Okay, hide that. Okay, so here you see the front end for the Leostream administrator web interface. I'm going to log in as the main admin. You'll see I'll use this exact same interface for the user with a slight difference. Here you see I've got the admin URL and I'll stick a login URL for the next one. So let's go ahead and sign in. So this is actually the 9.1 release, which is going to be coming out very shortly. So here you see our fancy new dashboard that we've added. So let's look at this first step, which is the identify step. Here I'm going to look at the different types of authentication servers that you can leverage with Leostream for that username password authentication. Basically, just about anything you might want to use. Active Directory, obviously, we see that used a lot, but we do also support any authentication system that supports the Open LDAP. And then also in Linux environments, we do support NIS. So if you have old NIS servers that are out there, you can leverage those in Leostream as well. And you can see I can use these all side by side. So if I have multiple domains, different types of authentication servers based on different projects or teams, you can put them all in here and manage them all together inside of Leostream. It's very straightforward to add authentication servers. Simply give us the authentication server information, credentials for a user who is allowed to log into that and actually do the LDAP calls in the case of AD so that we can authenticate users against that. And then one of the neat things is you can actually limit the login search. So if you are a large organization with a very large AD tree, and what you want to do is just have an authentication server here for a particular branch on that tree, you can have Leostream start at the top of that branch instead of at the top of your tree, and that will speed up user logins. So that's kind of a nifty feature there. Now you'll see on this page here, I also have Okta registered as my SAML-based IDP. So that is for this second workflow that I'm going to show you. So there's really these two ways of authenticating into Leostream. Either Leostream identifies the user based on their username and password, or your SAML IDP does. So going back to the username and password and Leostream identifying that, then if you want to authenticate, if you want to do that second factor, you come in here to the MFA providers. So for a second factor in Leostream, there's really these two different ways that you can do it here. We have integrated Duo support, and by this I mean if the user is logging in through the Leostream web client only, you can create an integrated Duo security MFA provider here, and then Leostream is using the Duo APIs to log into, or to the Duo APIs to do the second factor with. But for any identity provider, including Duo or Okta or Ping ID, we've seen a number of different systems used. Leostream does support Radius. So Leostream can speak Radius. In this case, I'm just talking to the Duo proxy agent, and then the Duo proxy agent is communicating with Duo to do that second factor there. And the nice thing about leveraging Radius is that that supports a wider range of Leostream clients. So the native Duo integrated is great for web client logins, but the Radius integration works with the web client, also PC over IP clients, Leostream Connect, pretty much any way you need to log in, you can do that. So those are the two main ways that we see people identify and authenticate users into Leostream, either through their SAML IDP or having Leostream integrate with some sort of LDAP server and an MFA provider. But there's also one other thing you can do in Leostream, which is define local users. You can actually treat the connection broker as an authentication server itself. And we do see that come up in special scenarios where maybe you have users who are coming in and out of your organization very quickly. You're not adding them to Active Directory, or your Leostream environment is managed by a team that's not managing the Active Directory, so it would just take too long to add users, or maybe there's restrictions about doing so. There's a number of reasons that you might want to do this, but I can come here to the Users tab here and actually create a local user. And so here you define your username and password. You can actually require the local user to go through your MFA provider as well. Again, that's Duo or Radius. And then you assign a role and a policy. So the policy here is authorizing what they have access to. We'll talk a little bit more about that here in a second. Okay, so we've identified and we've authenticated. Now let's move on to authorization. Really, it's the configuration you do of your VDI environment here that authorizes what the identified user has access to. And you start by creating pools. So you want to basically create these pools based on the different types of users and what they are restricted to have access to. Here I have a pool which is all of my Windows machines. And you'll see there's an option down here, associate all user notifications with assigned user. Here's that feature that allows you to say a particular identified user logs into Leostream, but a generic account is going to be used on the desktop. And so this tells Leostream, manage that generic account as if it belongs to the physical user who logged into Leostream themselves. So that's a very important setting that I have on for the Windows pool, because this is where the pool I'm going to use for that use case of logging into Leostream as domain and then logging into the machine with a generic account. So create your pools based on what you want to authorize users to have access to, and then create your protocol plans based on how you want to connect the users. But these protocol plans actually come into play in managing the user's ID as well, because again, their ID travels with them through the Leostream login all the way to the remote desktop. So if you see here, I have a protocol plan for RDP, and essentially what it does is, if I look at the RDP file, you notice I'm not passing any sort of user credentials in here. It's going to launch the connection to the desktop, but it's not sending the username, the password, or the domain. The same is true for the web browser login here, which is what you'll see me, how you'll see me log in. So it's going to launch the RDP client, and then I can type in my generic user account when I get to that. You could also hard code an account in here. If, for example, you don't want the users to know the passwords, you can enter in the passwords into the protocol plan for the protocols that support that. You notice here, I also have an RGS, or remote boost plan. Here's a case here. We give you ways to pass the usernames and the passwords to the Leostream Connect client in this case. And it says plain password there, but it is passed encrypted. We're not going to hand around unencrypted passwords. But this way, again, if you don't want your users to know the password for that generic account that's going to be used on the remote machine, you can hard code it into the protocol plan. Now the user gets connected, but that password remains even hidden from them. So the protocol plans, again, give you ways to potentially hard code user identities into the remote, to be passed into the remote machine. Gives you ways to remove the credentials so users can enter them in themselves. By default, what we'll do is we'll pass them through. So if you want single sign-on, that's easy enough to do as well. So I create my pools, my protocol plans. We're going to skip down to policies. Policies bring the pools and all the different plans together to create a set of rules that indicates everything the user has access to or is authorized to use. So if I look, for example, at my policy, this form is going to look different if you're used to seeing Leostream. This is the new policy form for the upcoming 9.1 release. So what I'll show you here on the general settings, again, we're focusing on managing user IDs. So if you are a PC over IP shop, sometimes what we've seen is you want to log into the client using, say, a smart card, but then you want to be able to log into the desktop using a username and password. Well, there's an option here to prompt the user for alternate credentials before they connect to their secondary machine. So this way you can actually change which credentials go to the PC over IP machine before that connection is established. If I look here over on pool assignments, I can edit this pool assignment here. So here I'm going to offer all the machines from my Windows pool. And you can see that I've assigned my RDP no credentials protocol plan to this particular pool. Now, the other thing I want to point out here, you see this log user into remote desktop as field. This basically allows you to say, do I want the user that logs into the remote machine to be a local user or a domain user? So for my Windows machine, it doesn't matter what it's set to because I'm going to have the user enter in their credentials here. But now for this Linux machine, if I go down here, you see it's set to local user. This is that first scenario where I talked about where I'm going to log into Leostream using my domain credentials, and then behind the scene, Leostream is going to map me over to the local user on the desktop. Now you'll notice that setting for how I want to log the user in, the defaulted to set by role. So if we look at roles here, you'll see I have a local user role. So I can actually set that setting globally for a group of users using the role. And I can also give the user options to collaborate or release their desktops, reboot their own machines through the roles as well. Okay, so all of this then comes together to finally get the user authorized. I look at the assignments table here, and you notice there are 4 entries here. There's one for each authentication server that I added up in the setup section. So that can either be SAML or it can be one of those username password authentication servers here. So if I look the way this is set up in my Leostream Active Directory server, I'm basically saying anyone who comes in from a web browser, they're going to pass through Duo MFA. And if all of that passes, that's the identify and authenticate, then here's what they're authorized to use. My policy, and they're going to log in as default as a domain user, and then that role setting in the policy will override that as a local user for Linux. Now, you notice if somebody tries to log in from anything that's not a web browser, they're just going to fall through to the default, which is going to block the login. So this is very important for controlling not just what people are authorized to use, but making sure that people who are not identified and authenticated aren't authorized to get anything. When it comes to SAML, basically your SAML identity provider sends a SAML assertion to Leostream, and the information in that assertion is the only thing that Leostream knows about the user. This is great for zero trust environments. You're not passing the user's password to Leostream at all. In my case, I have set up Okta, so there's an attribute called groups, and I'm using that groups attribute to assign the policies. So I have a demo group. Now I don't have an MFA column here because it's the SAML IDP that actually manages the MFA. So you'll see I'll do MFA, but it's outside of the scope of Leostream. We just know that this user is already identified and authenticated, and so we give them their policy. And again, if they fall through, no policy for you. Okay, so to start looking through how these scenarios all map together, let's start with logging in as a domain user. So I can come in here and I'll select my domain and go ahead and sign in. I'm going to request a push. It's going to send it to my phone. I'm going to hit approve. And now I'm in. So now you see my different machines. So first, let's connect to this machine here, which is a Linux machine. So that's going to map over to my local user on the desktop. So you saw remote boost kind of quickly went by. It was authenticated in the background there. And now I can log into the machine as my local user here. So that's logging in. We'll just move this out of the way so we can come here and see what's going on in Leostream while that's happening. So now as the admin interface, let's go over and look at the logs. So here I can see my login. I scrolled a little too far there. I can see my login, the machines that I requested. I requested a connection to that machine, so that assigned that machine to me. And now you can see the Leostream agent sending the notification that I logged in. And so you can see, if I go to the desktops page, now you see my user. This is my domain user assigned to that machine. On the machine itself is a local user, and that's the RGS port, or remote boost port. So you can see that I'm connected inside of there. So let's leave that open, and now we'll go back here and connect to that Windows machine. So now I'm going to connect here. This is going to prompt me for remember, I took the credentials out of the RDP file, so it's going to prompt me for a user. So let's go ahead and I'll log in as Mabel here. So I logged in again, my ID to Leostream. Now it's going to launch the RGS connection, or RDP connection in this case. Logging in Mabel, move that out of the way again. Now if I look what's happening here, you see in this case, I requested a connection to that new machine, so it assigned that machine to me now, launched the RDP file, and now the Leostream agent is sending the notification that Mabel has logged in. If I look back on the desktops page, I see that machine is still assigned to me, and if I run a status, I see that there's in fact a different domain user logged in, but behind the scenes here, Leostream understands that user here, this Mabel user, is related to my user identity. And I can see that in action if I go ahead and log out of that machine. So just come in here, I think it opened up full screen, so it's going to look a little strange. I have two monitors. Now let's sign out as Mabel. And what you'll see in the background here, the Leostream agent will come in with the notification that Mabel's logging out. And in the end, it will unassign the machine from me because it understood that that logout was associated with my Leostream user. Okay, so the next thing here, so those were all username passwords with Leostream handling the identification and the authentication. Now, if I go directly to my broker IP address without that /login, by default, what that's going to do is redirect me to the SAML identity provider that I've defined, which in this case is Okta. So I can come in here now and log in as my Okta user. Oops, let's just make sure I type that right. And there I go. Now I'm in again. And so here are my connections. Now again, Leostream doesn't have a username and password, so it needs to prompt me for information here. In this case, I'll log in as my same domain user. And then again in the background here, let's close that. I can refresh the log and I can see myself logging in to requesting the connection to that machine again and actually getting connected using my own username and password, which then gets mapped over. If I look here at the users page, you'll see there's one user for me, which now is associated with the Okta Authentication Server. So this actually is a subtle way that you can manage user identities inside of Leostream as well. You need to determine, does one particular user name, Kgondoli in this case, if they log into different authentication servers, is that the same physical user or is it different physical users? There's actually a setting in Leostream that you can toggle to indicate which one that is. And we see that being important more in bigger organizations where maybe they've gone through a merger and an acquisition and there were two user identities and two different companies before that had the same username, and now they're separate. They're keeping them separate domains, but they want to manage them in one Leostream environment. So Leostream needs to know, okay, if the user comes in through Okta, that belongs to one physical user, but if it comes in through AD, that's a different physical user. In my case, I have it set up so that the broker knows, oh, it's the same user no matter which one they come in. So the broker is just updating this user record with my new policy and to indicate which authentication server I came through. Okay. So the last thing I want to show for the bonus round is the rogue user login. Now, you notice here I have 4 users. This is just my little test environment. There is no user named Mabel here. Even though Mabel logged into the remote machine, that login was associated with my user ID. So she's not actually registered in Leostream yet. But let's say, for example, Mabel decides to come in and actually just RDP to that machine. So let's do that. Whoops. So now you'll notice, even though she's logging in directly through the RDP client, the Leostream agent caught that. Here it is, Leostream agent. Mabel logged in as a rogue user. And because I have a particular setting now set in the centers here, any of my machines that happen to be VMware machines coming from our vCenter server here, I have on the aside rogue user to desktops in this center. So now anytime a Leostream agent comes into the broker and says, hey, somebody's logged into this machine as rogue, and the broker knows this machine was inventoried from this center, the broker is going to assign that machine to the user and apply this policy. The policy then allows you to assign protocol, or not protocol plans, but power control plans and release plans to that machine so that you can monitor the user's idle time or you can reboot the machine when they log out. So now what you'll see here on the users page, since Mabel wasn't already in there, the broker went and created a user for her, assigned the current desktop to her, gave her a policy, and now she's a managed user in Leostream now as well. So that was our bonus round. So that was a lot. There's so many different ways that you can manage user identities inside of Leostream. If you want to give it a try, we do offer a free trial. Just contact us at sales@leostream.com. Thanks.